Welcome to Abstracts. This week, possession and exorcism.
I command you to depart from the servant of God.
The idea of the devil, evil incarnate, has irresistible symbolic force.
Possession is when the devil actually takes over the operation of the body of the person. The person doesn't even know what's going on.
I was shaking, I was screaming, I was different languages. I would do things that I wouldn't necessarily do.
Exorcism has deep roots in Catholic tradition when performed by priests given special permission by their bishops.
We believe in the existence of the devil, he says. The way to defend yourself against the devil is to go through the process of exorcism.
We're diagnosing diseases now with brain scans that we couldn't diagnose even 2 and 3 years ago. The brain is an incredibly complicated organ. The fact that some priest using 12th century technology can cure somebody is absurd.
I want you to tell me that you know for a fact that there's nothing wrong with my daughter except in her mind. You tell me you know for a fact that an exorcism wouldn't do any good. You tell me that!
Do you believe in ghosts? Are you a ghost guy? A demonic possession guy? How are you feeling about the paranormal, the supernatural?
I don't know. I mean, I don't exactly believe in it. So when I was younger, first of all, when I was in high school, I came home from school one day, and this was just fascinating. I don't know what she was thinking. I went up to my bedroom. All I'm focused on is getting home to play Xbox, and there's a priest in my bedroom throwing holy water over the room.
In your room?
In my bedroom. I mean, I kid you not.
How old are you at this point?
I don't know, 15, 16.
Right.
It was old enough for me to remember it and still think it's weird. And my mum was there with him, and she was having the house exorcised. So he was going around. He seemed quite focused on my closet. I don't know what he thought was in there. But there he was.
Yeah, there you were.
Yeah, I mean, look.
That's brilliant.
I
No,
mean,
carry
look,
on.
clear.
No, please, carry on. Sorry.
Look, clearly he knew something. So, I mean, that's the reason I'm kind of like, oh, well, maybe there's something to it. When I was younger, though, I mean, this I only have second hand from my mum. Well, actually, first of all, I should say she was having an exercise because there had been weird happenings in their house. Like, for example, and there's no other explanation for this, my father had taken down the A to Z London map before we went on holiday from the attic, put it on the dining room table, and then just before we left, it disappeared, and when we came back, it was in the attic again. Now, it can't possibly have been because he misremembered bringing it downstairs. So, it must be ghosts. So, that's fairly solid evidence. You're looking at me like I'm not being sarcastic. So yeah, I mean, there were apparently a few weird goings on. So my mum had the house exercised. But when I was younger,
Was she religious, your mum? Is she religious?
No, but she went on this Alpha course.
I saw those years ago. They were massive years ago. You'd see them outside churches, the Alpha course.
Indoctrination camp. So she'd come home and sort of say things, and we'd have sort of debates. Not exactly arguments, but debates about it.
Right.
I always thought it was a bit odd because it's not like you're going to go to the Alpha course and get a balanced view, is it, really?
No, it was designed to get people into religion, Christianity, born-again Christians, wasn't it?
Yeah,
really?
Yeah, I think so. But when I was younger, I have this secondhand. Apparently, I was talking to somebody at the end of my bed. So this wasn't attention-seeking as a kid because, my mum was a bit like, he's talking to himself. But no, apparently, as far as I was concerned at the time, I was talking to an old man at the end of my bed, which must have seemed concerning to my mum. But when I apparently described him, this police officer, he was an old man and all the rest of it, I don't know, apparently it was in some level of detail. It was the level of detail that my grandma linked fairly reliably to my great-grandfather, who was a policeman. And I don't know, I mean, who knows, maybe I got the family photos and I don't know.
Just when you were really little and it went in somewhere and those images went in somewhere.
Or maybe this is something very similar to the genetic memories. I don't know. Who knows? Or maybe he was a ghost. But that's kind of where I stand on it.
A ghost sat at the edge of your bed. Not near the closet, though.
Not near the there was nothing in there at that time. But yeah, what about you? Do you believe in ghosts?
I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I did have one experience once. I was living in Edinburgh. and I'd just been to the supermarket at the bottom of Leith Walk. And anybody who knows Edinburgh, they'll know Leith Walk. And I was walking back up, and on my right-hand side, there was like there's a row of terraced houses. And they're old school terraced houses. They're pretty dramatic because they're made of like old stone and, super Scottish.
Okay.
And stood in the doorway was a person. There was a person, and they were covered in rags or like paper. Not like a mummy, but not far off. And they were stood there in the doorway. It was just a glance, but I swear to God I saw someone there. And then I had to stop. I went cold. My body went freezing cold. And I just stopped in my tracks, and I stepped backwards and looked back, and there was nothing there.
Really?
Really. And I swear to God I saw something. I swear to God I felt something. You know what I mean? I felt in my body just this cold. And that was a pretty strong experience. I'm still convinced I saw something. It was really salient.
So there was an Egyptian mummy in Edinburgh trying to get into a terraced house.
Yeah, totally locked out. But then was, not there less than 60 seconds later.
Yeah, but this reminds me of the conversation we had only last week, actually, about hallucinated memories.
Right.
Right. So
the mustard apparition.
Not the answer, the source.
Yeah.
So I have a particular thing about people eating with their mouth open. I mean, it really gets to me. And I was walking down the road, and I don't know. I mean, there's a place called Tortilla. I assume there's, I forget the equivalent.
Tortilla?
Yeah, he said there's an equivalent American name for, but it's like a tortilla shop. And I was walking down the road, and someone was sitting outside eating, and they were just masticating away. Get that right. Masticating away, chewing this food with their mouth open. And I sort of glanced at them for a moment, and I remember my focus. I don't think I talked about this last week. My focus was on their mouth. I looked away and glanced back almost a moment later, because what I saw was their face covered in burrito sauce. I mean, they were absolutely vile people. A vile person, honestly, just covered in sauce.
Just quaffing away.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I looked back, and there was no sauce there. And I thought, I've hallucinated it, So maybe you looked at the door, and you saw something that looked like an Egyptian mummy, and then looked away, and then you looked back, and it wasn't actually there.
Maybe it was. Maybe it was a similar apparition to the sauce apparition.
That's what a heathen would say, though.
But I don't hate doors, right? I don't dislike the front of terrace houses.
That's true.
So, I don't know.
Maybe there's ghostly sauce apparitions going on.
It would make sense.
Tottenham Court Road, yeah. Well, there you go.
That's the thing. But obviously this is a dense subject. We're only really skimming the surface. There's so many ways and avenues that we could have got into. But before we do get into it, should we talk about the gin that we are drinking?
No, let's skip it this week. Yeah, no, it's really good, isn't it?
It's absolutely brilliant. We are drinking the Whitley Neal handcrafted dry gin in its original form. There are a number of forms. They have a blackberry version or a blueberry version. No, it's a blueberry version.
They have a raspberry one as well, I think.
Yep. I think they've also got a rhubarb and ginger, like our dear old Drury Lane. But it's brilliant. It's in a fantastic bottle. Big, sturdy, black cylindrical bottle. It's got a lovely cap. Fantastic cap. Nice labelling. And I don't know anything about the taste or the flavours, so I have consulted the website. And we'll just go with what they're saying. So it's slightly softer and much smoother than traditional gins. Would you agree, Matthew?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, it is. Would you say it had rich notes of juniper and citrus?
We might have confounded our study here, though, because we've thrown some garnish in, including wedge of orange.
That is true. It did recommend to drink with a wedge of orange.
It did, yeah. Then it can substantiate the claims.
That's true, but we did try and, balance it out with a bit of the cucumber and some rosemary, so... I am getting the exotic spices. It says exotic spices.
You're right, I am getting that, yeah.
Yeah. It's also saying with subtle fade of herbs, cocoa, and candied lemon peels, whilst the nose is both citrus sweet and peppery with a distinctive floral aroma.
We are honestly not sponsored by these people.
Absolutely not. But I assume all those things are true. I'm drinking it with relative ease. It's very nice. It's won a number of awards, and it is currently on offer in your local Sainsbury's.
Is it?
It is. Yeah, every bottle. Yeah. Decent.
Well,
so it's decent.
That'll explain why you got it this week.
Exactly. Yeah. Should we get into it?
Possession.
And
exorcism. Yeah, where did it start?
Yeah.
And how did we get to a point where we need exorcists?
Certainly from what I've been looking at, the belief in spirits is kind of universal. You know, whether it's either demons or whether it's animal spirits or ancestors or name your culture, they've got some kind of paranormal, supernatural thing. And it could also be argued that it's been around for as long as we've believed in a soul, that there's some kind of human inherent soul that we've all got.
Okay.
And could be kind of taken. There's also interesting stuff that was done by Graham and Haidt in 2010. So Jonathan Haidt, I've mentioned his work a couple of times, probably in each podcast. But he has a great paper called Beyond Beliefs: How Religions Bind Individuals into Moral Communities. And what he basically says is that our brain has a capacity for anthropomorphization. Anthropomorphism?
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's have anthropomorphism. That's the actual word. So our brain has this capacity. I suppose the best example of that is to watch a Pixar movie. Like any Pixar, even the opening of a Pixar movie that has a jumping lamp, that's anthropomorphization. It's putting human characteristics onto inanimate objects. Also, we look at gods, he says, as an antidote to loneliness. Some people are lonely. It also has a palliative effect. So people who are afraid of dying, you know, often look to god figures. God figures can also serve as a substitute attachment figure, according to Haidt. Also, belief in an afterlife is probably the result of an inability to conceptualize non-existence. So the idea of getting someone to think of what does nothing feel like is probably really difficult. So that could be one explanation as to why people believe in an afterlife. But in terms of possession itself, it goes back super long way. One paper I found said that they found skulls dating back to 5000 BCE that were thought to be involved in exorcisms because of the way that certain holes in the skull were drilled.
Oh, so they were trepanning the spirit out.
They were trepanning the spirit out, exactly. And yes, so it's been found all over the world, and even really, really recently, I found a pretty tragic story of a girl in 2007 in New Zealand who died during a Maori-style exorcism. And in that exorcism, they believe that what you do is you drown the demon out.
Okay.
So they just made her drink water, just force-fed her water, and she drowned, died.
Wow. So she's drinking it. She's not being drowned. She's drinking the water.
She's being force-fed water as part of this ritual. From what I remember, that's what it is. And then she drowned as a result of it. It was some kind of ritual exorcism, Maori style.
I mean, there's some weird ones that I came across as well.
Oh, yeah.
Some weird exorcisms. So, I mean, you actually just reminded me one of... it still happens today. It's Yoruba in Nigeria. They take the patient, they dress them in a new white cloth, they shave their head, and they put them waist deep in a flowing river.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing about a river is a river obviously only flows in one direction. So anything that is taken by the river isn't returned. Right, so this is the idea of catching the spirit in the river. And there's apparently quite a lot of this in multiple cultures of exorcism taking place in rivers because of this whole thing about it flowing in one direction. But then they
Would a baptism have taken place in a river as well, maybe?
I assume so. I mean, in Far Cry 5 it definitely did.
Interesting link.
Then they take 3 doves. They use them as living sponges to wash away the evil from the patient. All seems relatively normal. And then they're either drowned, the doves, or decapitated and their bodies flung downstream. And then the patient takes off his white wrapper, which also floats away, and the devil is borne away by the river. And on the doves and the white cloth. And there's another one, which I like even more. In Thailand, the spirits are induced to leave by placing a sticky ball of rice on various parts of the patient's body, starting from the tips of the toes. I can't even say it. And working upwards to the top of the head.
Little balls of rice.
Yeah, exorcism by sushi. It's just fascinating.
Drilling your skull or little rice balls.
I know which one I'd pick. Absolutely.
But even though we do have exorcism in all these cultures, it's probably wise we focus more on one.
Yeah, I mean, shout out to India with their boot spirits that you can send to people via magicians and shamans. Malaya, where people run amok because spirits take over their body and they run around killing people and animals until they're killed themselves. And Arctic hysteria as well.
Arctic hysteria.
So polar Eskimos in northern Greenland, they start by becoming irritable and socially withdrawn, and then next thing you know, they're trying to walk on the ceilings and shouting obscenely, throwing objects, eating feces, and other irrational acts. So yeah, I mean, and that's also meant to be a form of possession. So it happens literally from northern Greenland down to Malaya and India, happens everywhere. But yeah, like you say, let's focus on the Catholics.
Mainly because they're the most documented. They're the most I mean, they've documented it themselves for thousands of years, almost thousands of years. Certainly 1,500 years, last 1,500
Well,
years.
certainly no more than 2,000.
Yeah, certainly no more than 2,000. And also science has documented it as well. I guess this is because of the geography of psychology. Probably psychology takes place more in cultures that are Christian than it has elsewhere. So Christian possession is probably going to be more available to study than other ones in different cultures. But I guess, yeah, starting from zero, the information that I found across a couple of papers, and I'm sticking a couple of papers together here to create a little bit of a brief history, is that you can kind of date it back to the 1st and 2nd centuries, because it was supposedly came about from papers that were used to make the New Testament, and Jesus is said to be the first exorcist. 60% apparently of Jesus' miracles were exorcisms. Jesus' disciples would perform exorcisms, and also normal people, Joe Public, could perform exorcisms. Anybody could do it. And this goes on pretty much until 250 AD, when the church, because roughly around that time, the church decides to bring exorcism within the purview of the church. It means no more lay people doing it, no one without the express permission of a bishop. And generally it fell to members of the lower clergy, people who weren't priests yet, but who were going through priesthood. And it was seen as a stepping stone to priesthood by these people. But also, it was really closely linked to a university education. So in the 1600s, even in Hamlet, there's a scene in Hamlet where there's some ghost and someone, I think, says to Hamlet, like, "You're educated, talk to the ghost," more or less.
Okay.
So it was kind of tied together, common knowledge, that the university educated were the ones going about doing exorcisms. And what's kind of interesting about that is a university education at that time, these people are learning classics, they're learning ancient Greek stories, like all that kind of stuff. So that gives them a knowledge of classical literature and the classical structure. But the problem is that there's very little in the Bible about exorcism. If you find a passage where Jesus does an exorcism, he just says a word and the demon's gone. You know, there's no real process that you can really dive into that tells anybody how to do anything. And it's kind of argued that this information exists in the Apocrypha. And the Apocrypha are a collection of Gospels that aren't included in the Bible. It's said that they were written by a bunch of Jews in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and they weren't included because they were doubted. That's where Apocrypha comes from. It means doubtful. So they were doubted as being real. Jesus didn't think it was real. You won't find these Gospels in synagogues, and elements of them weren't really included until, later in the 16th century. No, sorry, in the 15th century. You've got all these members of the lower clergy out doing exorcisms, and over that time, they're developing these field notes, they're trying things out, they're basically given free rein. Nobody knows how to do an exorcism, so they're basically filling in a load of blanks, which, you could argue is they fill with their understanding of classical literature. And what happens is that in 1608, there's 4 priests. I won't name them and I won't go into their past, but they have really, really interesting pasts anyway. But they've got a bunch of treatises in 1608 by doing all these exorcisms. And what they do is they publish them in a compendium called the Thesaurus Exorcismorum. And this forms the basis of what's still used today in exorcisms, which is called the Ritual Romanum, which was a distilled version of this compendium, which was published in 1612. And what it was like the first directions for exorcism that people could follow. It was a system of prayers or pageantry and repeated codified phrases and stuff like that. And that formed the basis of exorcism, the structure of the exorcism was given to them during this time.
Yeah, so within the Thesaurus,
Yeah.
there are, like you say, a number of texts, this compendium. And one is, for example, Mengi's Flagellum. And this is a great example of an exorcism. First of all, the devil must reveal his name. So he asks for his name, for his accomplices, which role he plays in the demonic order, why he's chosen, the person he's possessed, how long he's been residing in the possessed, who his worst enemies in heaven and hell are, and how he will signify his departure. So that's a classic example of an exorcism. And actually, when you watch something like The Exorcist, the film, what you'll usually see is the priest or the clergyman adjuring the demon or the devil to tell him his name. So, it's thought that obviously every demon is another form of the devil, and therefore is the master of lies, or at least reports to the master of lies. However, they can be adjured to speak the truth by Christ, channeled through the priest. And so, you can essentially make them tell the truth. And the first thing is to take their name, and you might even burn their name over a candle when you've written it down, but that's the first step. And you see that in The Exorcist. He says, I adjure you to tell me your name. So that's how most exorcism starts. And even started before the thesaurus. That was the classic starting point.
There's a really great paper by Hilary Callendorf in 2005 called The Rhetoric of Exorcism, where she looks at the rhetorical structure of an exorcism. And what you just described falls into basically the outer structure, which she breaks down into three parts. There's a judicial part, there's the deliberative part, and then there's the epidectic part, or the ceremonial part. And in the judicial part, which is, I think, pretty much what you were just talking about, the demon will be asked its name, blah, blah, blah. But it'll be asked why you possessing this body, what right do you think you have, and the demon will disagree. It'll give a whole host of reasons as to why it thinks it deserves the body, all that kind of stuff. And then the priest will also, during this judicial side of it, will call in the help of the saints, call in the help of Virgin Mary to act as witnesses, and as a result it becomes this kind of trial. And during the deliberative process, or the deliberative section of this structure, the exorcist will command the demon to leave, in the name of God, in the name of Jesus.
Yes.
But even though the command is strong, so Jesus commanded the demon to leave, and it was just on the word, because the devil would accept that Jesus was the Son of God. I better take him seriously and leave.
Yeah.
But generally, it's not the strength of the command that does it. It's really the persuasion and coercion that the exorcist uses to persuade the demon to leave. It's almost like it out-tricks the devil, And then once that's done, when the process is finished, you move into the epidectic side of it, or the ceremonial side of it, in which you praise God and you blame the demon for causing such suffering. And that forms this idea of the trial. It harks back to Aristotle's definition of rhetoric, where he said the faculty of observing, in any given case, the available means of persuasion.
Okay.
So within an exorcism, the available means you have to persuade the demon to leave is that of Catholicism, the Catholic doctrine, that kind of stuff.
It makes sense that a lot of bishops wouldn't want to engage in that,
Absolutely.
debating the devil.
Yeah.
So I know you've also seen this, the Devil and Father Amort.
Mm-hmm.
So again, the director of The Exorcist.
Spoiler alert, by the way.
The Exorcist director. He then is invited by Father Amort, who was a very famous Italian cardinal, I think, wasn't he?
Mm-hmm.
Or was he? I might have that wrong. But
basically, he was the highest, the official exorcist of the Vatican diocese.
Yeah, and so he gets to attend an exorcism with Father Amort. But in this film, the director also interviews a high-ranking bishop, who essentially says, "There's no way I'd get involved." Because
Los Angeles. He was the bishop of Los Angeles.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. So, but he was just so against the idea that he would be ready to perform an exorcism. He said he's not spiritual or holy enough, which seems really odd. But what he's not saying is that he's not spiritual or holy, just that there are higher levels that you need to attain before you can enter into a debate with the devil himself.
That's the thing, and that's interesting about how far you come in 1500 years, because when exorcism first started, anyone could do it, and now it's strictly the holiest of holy practitioners can even look at it.
We should say that, I mean, that is the view of the Catholics, right? And so, if you think about the Protestants would still largely believe in the laying on of hands of lay people, because everyone is endowed with the Spirit of God. Right, and this is where one of the major divides comes. Whereas with the Catholics, it was all about saints and clergymen and the priests and being ordained by God. So that's one of those major divides between the Protestants and the Catholics.
The Protestants don't really go in for much of this stuff.
No, they did get a little bit involved, but in general, they were very skeptical of spirit possession.
But you can see as well, if you go back to the 16th century, you can see how the members of the clergy would be, to the average person, extremely impressive. They'd be educated in classics. They'd have all theological understanding. You could see why people would go to them for their answers.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
They were able to make really structured, persuasive arguments, based on this rhetorical structure. It's still very common in debate. If you take the average debate, like long-standing traditional debate, it will follow the classical arrangement of exordium, narratio, divisio, refutio, probatio, and peroratio. So it's like it has an introduction, it has a statement of facts, and it spells that all out. That's what's going on underneath an exorcism.
I mean, I guess the question is, what does an exorcism actually look like? And actually, how was that then misused? So if we think about the 16th century, I was doing some research on some of the most well-evidenced exorcisms. So, for example, the one that is really harkened back to is Laon in 1566. This is where it all kind of began, and this is in France, and you can really see how exorcism is being used by the Catholics in a political environment. But it's interesting, because when I was reading this, it wasn't exactly what I'd imagined an exorcism to be, because in my mind, it was The Exorcist. That's what an exorcism was like, or The Exorcism of Emily Rose, where she's jumping out of first floor windows and running across foggy fields and then speaking in tongues. So I'll read through this case study of Nicole Aubry and tell me what you think about this, and maybe just jump in with anything you think. But Nicole Aubry, she was a young girl, and when she was younger, the one thing we know about her medical record is that she had 2 head injuries when she was younger. So they were bad enough to leave scars. One was from a dog bite, which sounds horrific, and the other was from a falling tile, which resulted in permanent headaches. That was in the past, but she had this permanent headache up until the point of possession, right? Which is interesting. We'll come on to this later on in terms of the medical model, but at the time of her possession, she'd only just begun to menstruate, so you've got to also think there's hormones involved, and she'd just married this guy called Louis Pierret. So, in the beginning, essentially in 1566, at the age of 15, Nicole was alone in a church when her maternal grandfather appeared to her as a spirit. And he said he was in purgatory because he died suddenly after supper with unconfessed sins and with unaccomplished vows. So, I mean, how annoyed would you be if you had the perfect death? You go to sleep after supper and you're in purgatory because you didn't have time. Yeah, exactly. Didn't confess.
Well, that's his point, man. He should have confessed before he went to sleep.
Absolutely. The Catholics were hot on this. You better confess.
That's why you pray before you go to bed.
Yeah, well, he should have known. Pray before you die after supper as well.
There you go.
That's his fault, isn't it? But there we go. So he essentially asks Nicole to have masses said, alms given, pilgrimages made, including one to St. James's Shrine. God, this gin's really taking effect.
It's good, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really good. Really
good job,
smooth.
Willie Neal. It was super smooth.
Worryingly smooth.
They weren't lying about the smoothness.
Absolutely
It is smoother than your average gin.
So, yeah, this St. James's Shrine in northwestern Spain, it was rather beyond the means of the family. They did everything else, but they couldn't afford to
make the pilgrimage
to northwestern Spain. So Nicole begins experiencing these convulsive fits, followed by rigidity, but her headache, as I said, has disappeared. So they're very concerned. She is at this point trying to have what's called a good possession. So she's saying, this is the spirit of my grandfather. He's compelling us to do these things. However, they then make the decision to do a fake departure because they're hoping the spirit will leave upon the fake departure.
So their idea is to lie and say, oh, we're going to go on this pilgrimage when actually they're not going to.
Yeah, they thought they could.
What they're going to do, just like once around the street.
Yeah, it's not it's not gone into, but I sort of think, how far did they have to get before they were...
And also, isn't this demon residing in the body of someone? Wouldn't it see where they were going?
Yeah, well, exactly. But yeah, so Nicole saw through this because she's clairvoyant, and she kicked off. And essentially, the parents enlisted at that point the help of the locals, priest, the schoolmaster, and then a Dominican from a nearby monastery to conjure the spirits. So initially, the spirit claimed it was a grandfather, but was eventually induced to admit it was Beelzebub. So the image of Satan himself. The clue, apparently, was that good spirits and dead people's spirits don't enter living people's bodies.
Yeah, because you need the express permission of God to do that.
Right. And so it's apparently only evil spirits that do so. And they apparently did say that they had God's will of doing it because it was their way of proving the veracity of the Catholic faith.
Well, they would. They're lying demons.
They would say that, but then also adjured by a priest, they'd say it was God's will. And you kind of believe that as well, because everything that happens is due to God.
That's right.
And that was the reason for it. It was to prove the Catholic faith, because this was something that only the Catholics believed could take place. At that point, they erect a stage in the church at Vivonne so that the crowds could watch.
Oh, they loved these big spectacle exorcisms as well, didn't they? They were massive, these spectacles.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it was on these stages that they were doing the what's your name, and then writing it on paper and burning it in the flame of a blessed candle. And, then Beelzebub or Nicole would just writhe around in pain as if her feet had been put in a fire. And then eventually he became habituated to it and said, don't waste your time burning ink and paper. And then he demanded that a prince of his rank needed to be dealt with by a high-ranking bishop. So they shipped him off to Laon, just down the road, and they then put the stage up in the cathedral instead. So he'd upgraded. And he was doing twice daily processions through Nicole. And one of those processions, I say procession, it was basically a stand-up comedy act. And the jokes apparently would just go around the town. People loved it. So you had this demon that was doing stand-up comedy at the local cathedral. And the local Huguenots, just to be really clear, are Reformed Protestants. Or Reformist Protestants. When I say Reformed, I don't mean they've changed to anything else. It's just a new form of Protestantism. And they weren't particularly pleased. I mean, so this, for a bit of political context, was during the religious wars in France. So it's the Catholics and the Protestants really at loggerheads. So the Protestants, or the Huguenots, they were not happy about these demonic jokes going around the town. This is part of the fixture of the local cathedral. Absolutely fascinating. Not like The Exorcist, the film. Stand-up comedy.
No, there's none of that in there.
And so what would normally happen is they'd use blessed objects such as the cross or holy water or relics, but they only really hurt or angered the demon. And so unconventionally at the time, they were using the Eucharist. And so the Eucharist is, of course, the transubstantiation of basically bread and wine.
Bread and wine, yeah.
Into the body of Christ.
And blood of Christ, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so what they were using was their host, as they called it, the host of the Eucharist, was some bread or a wafer. In the literature, they call it a wafer. Someone could put me right on this. I assume it's just a thin piece of bread. But they're using this wafer.
Now the ones I've seen now, they're like little discs. They're very thin little discs. They're almost like crackers.
Is this austerity in the Catholic churches or something?
I'd imagine so. It's been going... Well, bread and wine. I don't think it's actually wine either now.
Oh, no. Really?
Well, it's just too dear, isn't it? Can't be giving everybody every Sunday. Can you imagine?
Well, Echo Fool's wine. You're good. You're all good.
Do you think Jesus would be happy with that?
That's true, but
Bit
then...
of Echo Falls. It's not even wine. He'd have to come back and change it, put his finger in it. That's not wine.
Yeah,
this is wine.
Quite offensive. That's a straight road to hell, that is.
Exactly.
Having Echo Falls. I've had many a night straight to hell on Echo Falls. But yes, they were using the Eucharist, and this was something, again, that the Catholics exclusively believed in, transubstantiation, and using the Eucharist. And what would essentially happen is they'd put it on the lips of Nicole, or have her eat it, and then she would be exorcised. So you might think, oh, well, fine, so she's being exorcised. That's done. No more possession. Yeah, correct, apart from the fact that during the day, she was often repossessed, sometimes as often as 50 times per hour. And usually the following morning, she was again repossessed on her way to church, conveniently. She would usually faint at the sight of the host, so the bread or the wafer, and then people would test whether she was a fraud or not, because everyone would be invited up to the stage to stick pins in her, amongst other things. And
so they'd have to decide... Do you mean they'd have to decide whether she was making it all up?
Yeah,
whether it was just a big act?
It wasn't so much that this was a test at this point. This wasn't really an experiment. This was just come and see how she really is. She's gone. She's fainted. She's comatose. Come and stick some pins in her. It was like an attraction. So the audience would get up there with their pins and stick it in her until the Eucharist or the wafer was placed on her lips, and then she would come back to life. Another thing she was up to was she was calling out people's secret sins, which were all... as it were, unconfessed. And when people went away and confessed and came back, Beelzebub or Nicole couldn't remember the sins that they'd been calling out. So they had all the priests on the outside of the cathedral with their confession booths ready to take confessions from the audience, who were terrified that they would be dobbed in by Nicole. So it was a great way of conversing people.
How much are they paying this woman to do all this stuff?
This is it, right? Because it gets even better for the Catholics, because, you know, she was essentially slagging off the Huguenots at every possible opportunity. So, for example, when finally a Huguenot minister does try and cure Nicole, but Beelzebub asks him whether the devil could cure a devil. And the minister replies, "I'm not a devil, but the servant of Christ." But Beelzebub then says, "Servant of Christ, you're worse than I am, for I believe what you won't believe, and I love you all the better for it." And what he's basically saying is, I believe in the true God and the Catholic faith. I am also a demon, but I believe in it. You don't believe in it, and I love you because you don't believe in it. And then he starts saying how he's written most of these Protestant psalms and all of this. So he starts basically saying that Huguenots are the devil's children. So he's really a spokesperson for the Catholic faith at that time and the anti-Huguenot truth.
And what was this girl's name?
Nicole Aubry.
Nicole Aubry. There's a similar girl from a similar time called Martha Brossier.
There is, yeah. So Martha Brossier, she had an account. She had an account of the Laon exorcism. So the Laon exorcism, eventually she was exorcised and then sort of, you know, lived out the rest of her life.
Because she was also part of a commission held by Henry IV.
Yeah, so Martha Brossier, she was a little bit later on. It was 1598, and the Edict of Nantes was formulated by Henry IV, exactly, which was essentially something like civil rights. So they split religious and civil rights. So finally, for the first time, the Catholics and the Protestants could live in some relative civility. I mean, a century later, that'd all be wound back. But at the time, that was a huge thing, and it was broken on a knife edge. And they really wanted to keep religious hatred to a minimum, or at least Henry IV did. So it was actually Marthe Brossier. She was 25 years old when, in 1598, she was possessed, reading the Miracle of Laon at that time. And again, same demon, Beelzebub. So the family wandered through the Loire Valley for 15 months, from one town to another, from Angers to Saumur to Cléry to Orleans to Paris, with her just being exorcised over and over and over again. They got a certificate of possession from the Orleans chapter, but eventually then they retracted that and said that this was a fictitious demon. And
a fictitious demon? It wasn't a possession?
No, so she was fraudulent, is what they were saying. And Angers, the bishop, then carried out empirical tests, which was quite interesting. So the bishop essentially was sprinkling holy water on her with no effect, not telling her it was holy water, but then sprinkling normal water on that he said was holy water, to which Marthe was thrown into convulsions and seizures, and due to the political environment, the Bishop of Paris eventually intervened and arranged for a team of doctors and theologians to assess her, and it became quite a famous diagnosis in the end. They then, or quote in the exorcism literature, they then said that there was nothing from the devil, much counterfeited, and a little from disease. But they reopened the case just afterwards for a great reason. They found an insensitive spot between her thumb and index finger, which was considered, it could be a witch's teat, which she was using to suckle her demonic...
familiar, or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. You could have like a little pig or a goat that you might be suckling with your witch's teat. So they assessed her again. They got rid of the skeptical doctors this time. So they were doing so well. They got rid of the skeptical doctors, brought in some more, and then, by the time they'd reassessed her, Henry IV had enough, put her away for 40 days, took her book away from her, which she had the whole way along, and was returned home. And then she was abducted by a friend of hers, Rochefoucauld, who then smuggled her down to Rome to see the Pope. But not before she'd been on an absolute nightmare. But not before she'd been on another anti-Huguenot just rampage. And at the time, the Cardinal was basically brokering the relationship between Henry IV and the Pope, because of course you could say it's religious repression. It's suppressing the faith. However, it was made very clear by the Cardinal to the Pope that Henry IV believed this to be fraudulent. So at the time, really, just to summarise, what you're looking at is an environment where the Catholics were using examples of exorcism or examples of possession and proving it through exorcism. They were using that to prove the veracity of the Catholic faith. And there was a lot written about, how did they achieve this? How was it, for example, that Nicole Lowbury could be on a stage and be talking in tongues, which apparently she was doing, when she had a swollen black tongue that was hanging out of her mouth. How was it she was doing that? And underneath the stage, it was blocked off, so you couldn't see underneath the stage. So was somebody talking under the stage? It really wasn't clear. And so there was a lot of that. And the more I read, the more case studies I found that were just like this. So it was used by the Catholics. I mean, whether there were real possessions as well, and you believe in that, that's fine. But this was a huge political exercise to try and show that the Protestants or the Huguenots were the devil's children.
Just as these people would be using exorcism and possession to prove the veracity of the Catholic faith, so too would Benjamin Franklin and this dude called Antoine Lavoisier use similar methods to prove the veracity of the scientific method.
Really?
In the 1780s. Earlier you were talking about they'd take them to churches and display, and it'd be almost like an act, and you'd go up and see whether this woman was possessed or stick pins in her, all that kind of thing, and the stand-up comedy thing. And that kind of ties into like these spectacles of mesmerism and hallucinations and hypnotism, almost like the vaudeville spectacles that were happening back in the day, man. And back in the 1700s, there was a dude called Franz Anton Mesmer, right? He was a German dude, but he worked in Vienna as a doctor. And he was inspired by this lunatic priest he'd been following around, right? And he believed that he could provoke similar responses in people as this priest was getting, but without Jesus. Without any kind of church, without any kind of religious dogma, any kind of Catholic dogma. So he starts mesmerizing things, and the word mesmerize comes from this guy, Franz Anton Mesmer. That's where we get the word mesmerize. And what he'd do is mesmerize objects, so he'd like almost enchant them, and he'd have people come up and touch them, and they'd have responses. Like by all their accounts, they were having some kind of experience after touching these mesmerized objects. But the thing was, it wasn't that they were just mesmerized. He said he'd found some new force. He described it as some fluid or some liquid or like something similar to magnetism. And this is what made Benjamin Franklin and Anton Lavoisier call bullshit. Because they were like, look, mate, it's not that we don't think that this kind of stuff could heal people. We just don't believe that you've found a force.
Yeah.
And they did very similar things. You could call them, the ones that you were talking about, you could call as trick trials back in the 16th century. But here in the 18th century, it becomes a placebo trial, really, a control group. And what they did is they used unmesmerized objects and mesmerized objects and checked the reactions of people, and they just found it to be absolute nonsense. In fact, they said something very, very similar to what your priest said, saying that this agent, this fluid, has no existence. It's in the imagination. And it was inspired by these trick trials from the 16th century in France.
There we go. So that must be the beginning of our empirical research, really.
Well, certainly the placebo, it could be argued that that's when it began. You know, that idea. And then it just kind of got reproduced into the scientific process.
Yeah.
Into the method. And I think that brings us up to roughly the late 18th, 20th century, into modern psychiatry, because in this time, psychology is really taking over. We're seeing the emergence of disorders. And the thing is because over all these years, the church has increasingly brought exorcism under the purview of the church, it creates more distinctions between possession and mental disorders. And as a result, I found one paper that says the devil starts running out of enemies in the 1970s.
Yeah. Well, that's the really interesting thing that I found from doing this research. I thought that mental health was treated as possession back in the day, but actually, largely, it was differentiated. So they knew there was epilepsy, and they knew there was what they called melancholy and hysteria, and it was seen that the devil would hide behind it. Mm-hmm. Or they would use those weakened individuals to get in, but they knew the difference. The French much more than the English, but they did know the difference. So I guess the development of psychology sort of began from there, and like you say, you start running the devil out.
Yeah, this is it. It becomes, in the 70s, it becomes this argument between the non-believers and the ignorant and naive.
Sounds very much like the Brexit episode we did last time.
It really does.
Divide between two sides. So before we move into the medical model, which I assume is where we're going with this, because this, we're in the 70s. What we don't want to do here is just come straight out of exorcism and possession and just go straight into mental health, because, like we said, even the Catholic priests did see a difference between them. So, what is mental health, and how do we define it? It's a difficult one, isn't it? I mean, you might just say it's the absence of pathology. It's the absence of bad mental health is mental health. But that only really tells us what mental health isn't, and it doesn't really, we still have to define mental disorders, and we might have missed some. But then also it doesn't take into account differential behaviours across cultures.
Yeah. There's no transculturalism.
No. You might also say, mental health is the correct perception of reality, but like we've already talked about, people literally perceive the world differently. Even between people on the left and right wing, let alone the east and the west of the world in different cultures. And then also who...
Psychiatrists and priests.
Yes. And then also who defines correct. So you might also say, common psychology or being neurotypical is mentally healthy. But then what about people with abnormally high IQ? Are they unhealthy? And then if you're going to say it's only in the negative direction of abnormal, then how do you define the negative direction? Because many people that are brilliant or genius will also have additional negative traits.
Eccentricities.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly. There's another really, really good one that's used, the adjustment, or the ability to adjust to the environment. So as your environment changes, the ability to adjust to it is seen as being mentally healthy. And you might also just say the ultimate concept from the research is that if a person is able to cope and function normally in a society, meeting their responsibilities and having a balanced attitude, towards their day-to-day challenges and problems, then they're mentally sound and possess normal mental health.
Whatever society that is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as that changes as well, the environment changes, the society changes, you adapt with it.
If they are fundamentally operating in a consistent fashion with what is viewed as good within their culture, then they're viewed as mentally healthy. People are mentally healthy.
So at the extremes, I mean, even this, you can subject it to a stress test. You might say people in Nazi Germany, you might say they're mentally unhealthy just by virtue of the fact they disagree with what's going on. So it's still a fragile definition, but it's the best working definition we have, because it's such a difficult thing to pin down. Because of, exactly like you mentioned, transculturalism.
That's exactly why possession is so hard to put into an existing disorder. I found one study that basically breaks it into two categories to begin with. It says there's an anthropological view and there's a Western medical view. The anthropological view is that possession is grounded within cultural belief. And I think, we've seen a lot of evidence for that. The kind of culture you grow up in will define the kind of spirit that is possessing you, and the kind of ritualistic exorcism that you might go through. But then there's the Western medical, which is pathological, that there's some kind of pathology, there's some kind of mental health problem, there's some kind of personality disturbance going on. And then this particular paper, which is called Demonic Attributions in Non-Delusional Disorders, it's from 1999 by a guy called Samuel Pfeiffer, does a review of the literature and basically puts possession into four categories. It's described in four categories that he found. One, that there's a culture-bound component to it, a witchcraft component to it, a hysteria and dissociation component to it, and a delusional component to it. And in the cultural-bound one, it might not be an illness, but the behaviour of being possessed by a spirit may be deliberately induced during a ritualistic exorcism.
Yes.
That's what's interesting in The Devil and Father Amott, is that the woman that he exorcises, before the exorcism begins, she's not in that trance state. She's in her normal state, and then he begins, and she begins to respond. The demon inside her begins to respond. So that's almost like ties in with the culture bound. In terms of witchcraft, possession was seen as a kind of consequence of witchy activity. So if you were involved in rituals or witchcraft or, hubble, bubble, toil and trouble, it'd result in abnormal behaviours. And that's what they attributed to witchcraft. It was a form of mental illness, but it was brought about by engaging in witchcraft or witchy activities. What's interesting is hysteria and dissociation. We're getting kind of more modern, I'd imagine, in his research when we're talking about this, because this is culturally shaped hysteria. So you can become hysterical, especially in communities where it's not particularly cool to express your feelings, your personal feelings, or to overtly express your emotions is kind of improper. This kind of reminds me a little bit of Freud when he talks about repression. And actually, Freud has an interesting thing here. He says about possession itself. He says, for us, demons are bad, forbidden desires emerging out of repressed and rejected drives, of course. We simply project the outer world, we simply project into the outer world the image that the Middle Ages has created out of these psychic creations, and we leave them develop within the inner life of the sick, in which these images establish themselves. So someone's cultural background has created these images of demons, angels, devils. It comes along with all this kind of cultural stuff, and we just kind of let it gestate in them, and when the possession shows itself, that's the way it shows itself. It shows itself in this religious context, in this Christian context. And just to finish up, in the delusional side of it, people very often, in states of delusion, report being possessed by demons. It's not that they have that cultural background. It's just that their delusion will have them report that. And that's very often linked to things like schizophrenia, childhood trauma, and psychosis.
That's really interesting. I mean, it almost sounds like you're saying the culture is the carrier oil.
Well, according to Pfeiffer in his literature review, one of the components in which possession is discussed is culture-bound one that, you know, it's all wrapped up in your cultural beliefs.
And, you know, look, we all express ourselves through our cultures, you know, both consciously and subconsciously. So, I mean, that's another way of it manifesting itself. I mean, there's a whole field that's sprung up around this idea of transculturalism. So, ethnopsychiatry is a huge field, and that really well demonstrates how difficult it is to pin down what is normal and what is abnormal.
Can you just define ethnopsychiatry?
Well, it's the idea that, you know, different ethnicities will have different psychiatric needs.
Mm-hmm.
And so actually the demonstration is a good one for demonstrating, you know, what they do. So, for example, to demonstrate the difficulty of diagnosing mental illnesses across cultures, there's the case study on these two Pueblo Native Americans that were sentenced and were on death row in America, facing the electric chair. It doesn't say in the study what they did. I assume it was something egregious. But they were trying to establish in the first instance whether they were sane or insane, because that would obviously affect the sentencing. They were talking about witches, and the witches made them do it, and it was all to do with the witches and witchcraft and possession. And they brought in an ethnopsychiatrist who said, okay, you might think they're insane, but within their culture, this is all very normal. So everything they're saying is normal and expected. So no, they're not insane. Within their culture, they're perfectly sane. There's no pathology. This isn't going to be traced back to some kind of pathological illness. This is just cultural. But they're sane within their culture. But there was something niggling at the ethnopsychiatrist, and he brought in an even more senior ethnopsychiatrist and said, I want you just to meet these people. And they started talking about witches again. And actually, this person in the study says it'll be a little bit like some naval officer giving the codes to the submarine's nuclear weapons or something, within 10 minutes of meeting them. He said there was just something wrong about, how quickly they divulged all this stuff about witches, because usually you have to really do a lot of groundwork and tease it out of them. So he said, okay, hold on. So they've been very upfront about telling me about the witches, which is normal within their culture, but it's not normal to tell me this quickly and go into it this deeply so quickly. But I mean, they are on death row. Okay, how did you try and deal with the witchcraft? Because in your culture, there are X, Y, and Z things you should do. There's certain societal prescriptions for witchcraft, certain things you should do to deal with it.
I see.
And they hadn't done any of them. And so this guy started saying, okay, hold on. And he started drilling down into it more and more. And he found that really, okay, yeah, they're talking about witchcraft, which is normal in their culture. But within their culture, they still didn't deal with it normally. There was still something there about their behavior that was not normal. And eventually he did diagnose one as schizophrenic and the other, I think, as paranoid in some way. But one was severely schizophrenic. And so that just shows the complexity when you're dealing with other cultures.
That's pretty fascinating, because in this Pfeiffer paper, he goes on, he used the anthropological and the Western model of possession to kind of lead into his own study. And in his own study, he took 343 psychiatric patients, but they were non-delusional. And he saw them over a period of 10 years. And they were often referred by clergy, and all of them had gone to workshops on psychiatry and Christian counselling. And basically, he took this group of people, 343 of which 114 were men, and 229 were women, and he split them into 3 groups. And in the first group were people who believed that it was possible that a demon was causing their problems. The second group, Group B, were comprised of people who had undergone deliverance rituals or exorcisms. And Group C, which was a control group, a group that held no such beliefs. He found in 56% of the schizophrenics, absolutely, demonic possession was attributed. They attributed a demon to their schizophrenia, right? But the purpose of the study was to look at the non-delusional patients, and he found it also in non-delusional patients. He found it in 48% of those with anxiety disorders, 37% of those with personality disorders, and 23% of those with adjustment disorders. And the interesting link with anxiety is that anxiety is generally a distress that's caused by some ego dystonia, and it's very similar with a panic attack. So a panic attack is generally accompanied by a load of symptoms. You might start breathing heavily, your heart might start fluctuating.
Somatic symptoms being
exactly,
like
symptoms.
body symptoms.
Yeah, bodily symptoms,
bodily
physiological symptoms.
Yeah.
And the experience of that, it's uncontrollable to the individual going through the panic attack because these feelings are alien, they're foreign, and they're uncontrollable. And that was the link that they said could be happening. It was significantly correlated with church affiliation.
No surprise there.
Patients with belief in an occult causality were also often from rural areas and of a lower education, and diagnosing possession as being the reason for mental illness was more typical in free churches, independent churches.
Okay.
They were more likely to attribute demons to a psychiatric disorder than, say, Roman Catholics, Presbyterians, this kind of stuff.
That's interesting.
More independent churches.
And that really brings us on to the medical models and
to the disorders.
Things that we now diagnose in place of possession. Or, in fact, sometimes we do diagnose possession.
Yeah, they certainly have done. Before we do, more GN?
Yeah, absolutely. We're running low. No, I mean,
shit.
My glass is running low.
Drunk.
How much have you had?
I've only had the same as you, mate.
Yeah, well, I've had enough.
Well, it's a symptom of a type of disturbance in the chemical electrical activity of the brain. In the case of your daughter, in the temporal lobe. It's up here in the lateral part of the brain. It's rare, but it does cause bizarre hallucinations, and usually just before a convulsion.
A convulsion?
The shaking of the bed. That's doubtless due to muscular spasms.
Oh, no, that was no spasm. Look, I got on the bed. The whole bed was thumping and rising off the floor and shaking, the whole thing, with me on it.
Mrs. McNeil, the problem with your daughter is not her bed. It's her brain.
But yeah, that really brings us into the diagnostic tools that we have at our disposal. So things like dissociative disorders, and actually it can get as specific as dissociative trance and possession disorders that we shorten to DTD. There's also anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis. So essentially, NMDA is just a receptor on your neuron, and it's really, it's throughout your brain. So this isn't any specific pathways. It reacts with glycine and glutamate, which are some of the most common neurotransmitters in your brain. It is very important in memory and things like that, but of course memory is located across the cortices. So when your NMDA receptor is attacked by an antibody that's basically present in your cerebrospinal fluid, this can cause symptoms similar to possession. What will essentially happen is that you'll start having sleep dysfunction in the first instance, and actually there's some sneezing as well that starts in the first instance. And I found some really interesting case studies where people start with sneezing and then they go on, and then they're possessed.
Well, it's funny because we say bless you after you sneeze.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting point.
There was this is just anecdotal, word of mouth. But the stories that I heard was that, you know, you sneezed because there was a demon inside you, and when you sneeze, you say "bless you." When this demon's coming out of you when you sneeze.
Well, this might be due to anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis. And encephalitis, for anyone listening, is essentially just brain inflammation. So the way it's usually triggered is there's a tumour. There's types of tumours that trigger this.
Isn't it to do with the water as well, water retention? Or is that as the brain forms?
You're thinking about just encephalitis.
Yeah.
So this is actually just, essentially there's a tumour, your body reacts to it with an autoimmune response, but it goes too far, and those antibodies that are released to deal with the tumour then also start working on your central nervous system, and they work on certain pathways in the brain. And those pathways are responsible, the NMDA is really responsible for helping your neurons fire. So what you can think about it is, the way you can think about it is that your brain is slowly being turned off. So the electrical impulses are slowly being turned off because the chemical pathways that help those electrical pathways are being stopped, essentially. So that's the biology of it. But, I mean, when you watch videos of this, you can see why they thought it was possession. Because not only do you have sudden onset psychosis, and you enter dissociative states, you can become very aggressive and agitated, but then you also start having movement disorders, so you become very rigid, and you start, I mean, if you think about The Exorcist or the exorcism of Emily Rose, those movements that you think are just Hollywood, well, that's what you see with patients of anti-NMDA encephalitis.
Whoa.
You should just YouTube it. It's quite amazing when you watch it. And there's a film on Netflix called Brain on Fire, which shows this. It's a lady that had it. Again, like we said earlier about amnesia, there's full amnesia. So you wake up, 3 months gap in your memory. And in that 3 months, your whole life has fallen apart. You've been, very aggressive, very psychotic. And very, very often, this was a disease that was mistaken for possession. But I thought it was fascinating that in the manuals, there's dissociative possession disorder. And actually, it can be very specific. It's, one of the diagnostic lines on there, it says conviction that, or the symptomatic lines is conviction that the individual has been taken over by a spirit, power, deity, or other person. But then also, it must be unwanted and troublesome. But yeah, I mean, there's a range of different disorders, and I know you've looked into this as well. So, I mean, what did you find when you looked at this literature?
I began by looking at clinical psychologists. I found a paper by a guy called Beelzebub in '93, who was a practicing clinical psychologist.
Okay.
And he was looking at possession in terms of multiple personality disorder. Could you say that it is multiple personality disorder? If you take them two together, what it can do is form what he calls a double aspect picture. In that possession exists as part of the same database as multiple personality disorder. It comes from the same place. It's just a different expression of the same thing. That's what the double aspect picture means. But the issue with that double aspect picture is that you can make distinctions between the two phenomena, which the church does, which actually the church actively tries to do, which makes this process even harder. The more distinctions that are made by the church, the harder it is to put it into any particular psychological condition. But where it differs from multiple personality disorder and the double aspect picture begins to break down is that MPD is one individual personality. It's just that personality is fragmented and it's split into different pieces. And it's the purpose of the psychoanalyst or the psychologist to integrate those separations back together into that one person. Possession is two separate personalities. That one of which has to be removed. And the removal of that is generally through exorcism rather than psychoanalysis. And those distinctions make it very difficult to reduce possession into multiple personality disorder. And that double aspect picture breaks down because of those distinctions.
Yeah, and those distinctions, I haven't really looked too far into this, but I imagine are fairly false distinctions, because if you think it's broken into your shadow side or the demon,
right,
and your light side. So Carl Jung, for example, will talk about your shadow side. Everyone has their shadow. And actually, you need a shadow. It's a necessary yang to your yin. It's a necessary counterbalance. And so maybe when you split into two personalities, when you dissociate in that way, then what you have is one where you say, well, this needs removing. Whereas in actual fact, although it might seem scary, to integrate the demon and what seems like, the nice guy, actually is what needs to happen, as opposed to trying to remove the demon. And so then that differentiation, it's hard to argue against that and say, no, we're not trying to remove this demon, we're trying to integrate this terrible thing into the personality.
Yeah. But you can't do that.
Well, from the church's perspective.
From the church's perspective, because those distinctions are made.
Or from the lay perspective. I wouldn't want a demon integrated into me, but we all have one.
But that does bring us on to the DTD, which is dissociative trance disorder. Now, what's interesting is this paper actually comes up in that film, in The Devil and Father Amort, when the psychologists are talking around the table. There's a shot of a paper, and it is this very paper.
So you mean the original paper?
Yeah, the original paper. It's called... it has a longer title, but I've abbreviated it to just dissociative trance disorder. It was written in 1996 by Ferracucci, Sacco, and Lazzari from the Department of Psychiatry in the University of Rome. They recruited people for this study through the official exorcists of the Rome diocese, and over the course of a year they watched 400 exorcisms take place on 100 people. Of the 100 people, however, only 16 of them fit their criteria for study. The qualifying criteria was that a person would only be included is if during the observation they behaved in a way that was really contrary to their normal behaviour, and that happened during the exorcism.
Right.
So presumably a whole bunch of them didn't. Only 16 of them did. Out of the 16 that fit, only 10 responded. So in a way, it's actually quite a small sample.
Absolutely, yeah.
Of that 10, 3 were men, 7 were women, and all of them were amnesiac to their possession. When they went into the state, when they went into the trance, they had no memory of remember it. None of them were getting any form of psychiatric help. In fact, most of them said that psychiatric help wasn't helpful. Exorcism was more helpful. Out of this group of 10, 2 of them had previously been diagnosed as schizophrenic and had been treated with neuroleptics, which are antipsychotic medications.
Right.
And 7 out of that 10 were ex-members of ritualistic satanic groups, and one of them was possibly epileptic when they were a kid.
Well, seems like a perfect random sample, doesn't it?
Exactly. The agent itself, during the possession, this alternate personality, which we can refer to as an agent, was always opposite in character. Was always the opposing character, was always mean, was always terrible, the opposite character.
It was always the shadow side.
That's right. And they had concerns that were very aggressive and very sexual, which again ties into the Freudian perspective of repressed sexual desires. But it was always a devil. Whatever the agent was, it was always a devil in some form. It was always male. And it always had an identity, whether that be Satan, Lucifer, Beelzebub, Asmodeus. The demon would very often congratulate itself on taking over the body. There'd be really intense motor behaviour, rolled eyes, deep gloomy voice, all that kind of stuff. None of the people reported any childhood sexual abuse, although there was one instance when during the possessed state, when one of them was in a trance, speaking in the first person, the demon itself said that it had been abused as a child in the body of the person.
Yeah, well, repression can often make you, it's in the name, repress those memories. So a lot of people don't realise they have been.
They did what's called a DDIS, which is a dissociative disorder interview schedule. So they interviewed them for dissociative identity disorder. And then they also use Rorschach tests. So a Rorschach test is the ink blot. You'll have an ink blot. You'll
tell me what you see.
Tell me what you see.
Looks like a butterfly. Yeah.
What they found was that people, they were very, very high in dissociative symptoms. They were really, really low in bipolar symptoms. 9 of them, according to the Rorschach test, had a very severe impairment of reality and had a really complex way of arranging or organizing reality in their minds. They had a real problem with ego dissociation and real radical projections of what they thought was going on. They were obviously aggressive sexual responses when the agent had taken over, which shows that there's a concern for those things, for aggression and sexuality. And also people tended towards extroversion. So in this group of 10, which is obviously a very, very small sample, they tended towards extroversion. And the the trance, the framework of Christianity and the framework of Catholicism gave them a controlled disorganization. So when they did get disorganized, it was in this particular fashion, within this particular frame, which really sits with your transculturalism. It's always going to sit within that frame. It's going to organize itself and orient itself towards things that you already know. So whether it's your spirit animal, demonic possession, ancestor.
The more you describe it, the more it sounds like me as I get down this gin.
Absolutely.
That sounds like an interesting paper, but like you say, I mean, it's in terms of its statistical power, its reliability, it's largely controlled by the 10 sample size.
Yeah, 7 of which are ex-satanic ritualistic worshippers. And the other thing is as well, if they tend towards extroversion, it's very possible that only the people who are willing to be observed were extroverted. They're quite happy. If you believe in a fraudulent model, and if you believe any of them are being fraudulent, then maybe they're so extroverted that they're quite happy to put on these performances in front of complete strangers who may not believe what they believe.
Well, this is it. I mean, so I found a similar study on DTD, and it had a sample size of 402. Only 58 had a comprehensive clinical history, but most of them had clinical notes, and it was from across 28 articles. So this is a meta-analysis. If anyone wants to read it, a critical review of dissociative trance and possession disorders.
It'll be in the references.
During 2011. It's a great meta-analysis. So it looks at 28 different papers, 19 from Asia, 5 from Europe, 2 from America, 2 from Africa. So it's quite broad. And they have, for 114 of those in the sample, there were treatments that were essentially listed, so we could see some of the treatments and some of the outcomes from those treatments. So but first of all, they sort of listed some of the etiology or some of the causes that they thought were behind the DTD diagnosis. And in 68% of the sample, 68% of the papers, I should say, they listed psychosocial stresses as being really high. In 64% of them, they also listed cultural factors, and then it drops off a cliff. And then there's gain seeking, like you say, fraud, hysteria, communication theory, traumatic theory. So in about between 60 and 70% of the papers, it's psychosocial stresses and cultural factors. A really fascinating one was that in 59% of the patients, or 59% of that 114, they used psychotherapy. And in all but one, and only because one didn't continue the treatment, in all but one, so essentially everyone, it worked. It worked. And there were also traditional medicines used, like antipsychotics, where over half of them showed clinical improvements. Antidepressants, where again over half showed improvements. And, anti-anxiety drugs as well. So there was a lot that shows that drugs and psychotherapy together really, really works. And there was another study I found where there was a girl who was possessed by jinns. So
Islamic genies.
Yeah, essentially. And selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, a strong antidepressant that was used to great effect as well. So within 4 weeks she was feeling better. Over a year, no more possessions. So there's a lot of evidence that with good psychotherapy and drugs where required, you can treat demonic possession. So no priest required. And funnily enough, there were no Hindus popping up with Beelzebub, sort of Catholic demons, and there were no Catholics popping up with Hindu gods. So psychotherapy can effectively treat DTD.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much, Matthew.
Thanks, Andy.
And take it easy. Catch you next time, everyone.
Catch you later.
Thanks for listening to Abstracts. Music, as always, was Coffee by Cambo. It's available at the Free Music Archive. Link is in the description, along with all the other media we used during the episode. If you'd like to check out the references we used during the episode and all the other episodes, they're available at our website at abstractspodcasts.com. That's abstractspodcast.com. It's through the website as well. You can get in touch, so drop us a line if you like us, hate us, want to correct us, etc. Until next time, happy Halloween.